If you really want to know the truth, the whole truth that is, then yeah, I'd have to agree that there were times I should have realised that something was wrong. Times when it should have been blindly obvious that the stories I was being told didn't actually make much sense. But it's all too easy to look back with hindsight and spot the clues that you might have missed along the way, especially when you're right in the thick of it. It's a hell of a lot harder to be objective. And when two of your closest friends get into your car, just seconds after they've brutally murdered 3 people, and even though they're all covered in blood and bits of brain, they start laughing, joking, giggling like a couple of schoolboys who've just seen their first naked woman. Well, then it's pretty hard to accept that you've unwittingly become part of their crime. On May the 15th, 1996, Darren Nicholls, a little-known petty criminal from Braintree, Essex, disappeared from the face of the earth. The arrest of the stocky 30-year-old electrician 2 days earlier, after 10 kilos of cannabis were found in the back of his transit van, had only barely made the local news. But less than 24 hours later, Nicholls had become the man who everybody wanted to talk to. Detectives from the drug squad were standing by to quiz him about a further 50 kilos of cannabis that had been found sitting at the bottom of a lake. Officers from Scotland Yard's anti-corruption squad wanted to know about his links with a policeman that they were investigating for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice and other criminal offences. While officials from HM Customs and Excise wanted to know about numerous trips abroad that Nicholls had made, during which hundreds of kilos of drugs had been smuggled into the country. But first in line were the Essex Murder Squad. They wanted to talk to Nicholls about the bodies of 3 drug dealers that had been found in a Range Rover in a quiet lane in Rettendon a few months earlier. Patrick Tate, Craig Rolfe and Tony Tucker, all 3 well-known local villains, had each been blasted in the head with a shotgun at point-blank range. Their faces were so distorted that, had their fingerprints not been on file, they would have been almost impossible to identify. Compared to the 3 dead men, Jack Womes and Michael Steele, the men who would later be accused of killing them, Nicholls was a nobody, a bit player in the Essex criminal underworld that includes everything from hitmen and gun runners to car thieves and fraudsters. Nicholls was about as close to the bottom of the ladder as it was possible to be. But soon after the police arrested him, they realised they had a prize beyond measure. Nicholls had worked closely with both the killers and the killed. He knew exactly how their extensive and wide-ranging criminal operations worked, and understood the elaborate techniques they employed to avoid capture. He was on first-name terms with all their contacts throughout Britain and Amsterdam. He knew their plans to expand into Europe. He knew who supplied their drugs and their weapons. Most importantly, he knew exactly who had pulled the trigger on that night. If the police could persuade him to talk, to switch sides and turn grass, they knew that Nicholls could be the key to a string of convictions. As it was, they hardly needed any persuasion at all. As he stared at the blank walls of his police cell in the hours following his arrest, Nicholls knew that even if he didn't talk, the men he once considered to be his friends would hunt him down and kill him, just as they had hunted down and killed the others who stood in their way. Today, if you take a trip down to the Public Records Office, you'll find no trace of Darren Nicholls. His birth certificate and marriage licence have both been deleted, his national insurance number has been withdrawn, his passport details destroyed. All his bank and building society accounts have been closed down, along with all his old store cards and hire purchase loans. His driver details have been erased from the computer at Swansea, and he no longer appears on any electoral roll. Even his criminal record is no more. Every possible path that someone might use to try to track him down has been blocked. It is as if he was never born. And it is just as well. In the run-up to the murder trial where Nicholls was the key prosecution witness, according to the police the most important supergrass since Albert Donahue betrayed the Cray twins in July 1968, the price on his head rose to a spectacular £250,000. All avenues were explored. His mother and brothers were watched and followed to see where they might lead. Friends and neighbours were approached in pubs and clubs and pumped for information or offered bribes. Letters proclaiming that Nicholls had won free holidays and the like were sent to his old address in the hope that they would be forwarded on and he'd reveal himself. All to no avail. At first, Nicholls and his family felt secure in their police safe house, surrounded by panic buttons, alarms and video cameras. But the longer they spent on the witness protection program, the more he felt that the police promises to look after him once the trial was over were little more than a sweetener to ensure that Darren gave evidence at trial. Nicholls never expected a life of luxury in some fancy foreign villa, but the reality, a handshake and directions to the nearest dole office, fell short of even his worst expectations. Nicholls desperately needed to talk it all through, but there was no one around. His wife was too angry with him, the police were too busy. It was only when he heard that one of the senior officers on the murder case was so fascinated by what had gone on that night that he planned to write a book about it that Nicholls himself found a solution. After all, he was the one who had been there. He was the one who had seen the blood-stained hands and smelt the smoking barrels. He was the one who had suffered the nightmares and would have to live a life of guilt and fear. If anyone was going to write a book, surely it should be him. The anonymous phone call to my office, promising to tell me the inside story of the Essex triple murders, came out of the blue. Nicholls had persuaded his police bodyguards to take him to a bookshop, and he had made straight for the true crime section, where he spotted a copy of my first book, Gangland Britain. During that first call, he refused to tell me who he was, or anything about what he might be able to tell me about the killings, only that he was certain I'd be interested. Intrigued, and with hindsight feeling a little reckless, I happily followed his complex instructions, which seemed to come straight out of a Hollywood movie. Drive to this service station, drive around this roundabout 3 times, park down this side street, pick up the ringing public telephone, and so on. I later found out that Nicholls and his minders had tailed my car for several miles to ensure I was alone. Nearly 4 hours after my journey began, I found myself searching for a space in the car park of the Romford branch of McDonald's. As my car drew to a halt, a cautious-looking Nicholls tapped on my window. I've always been fascinated by supergrasses and police informers. The life of a professional criminal is fascinating enough on its own, but the life of someone who betrays their friends and gives up everything to save themselves is all the more fascinating still. Just how do you live under a new identity? How easy is it, overnight, suddenly to become someone else? How can you live with yourself knowing that you are free only because your evidence sent others to jail? That meeting in the McDonald's car park was to be the first of many with Darren Nicholls, during which he slowly, carefully, and occasionally emotionally began to recount the story of his involvement in the Essex crime scene in one of the most notorious murder cases of recent times, and in Britain's little-known witness protection programme. This is that story. Darren Nicholls was nearly 5 years into a career with British Telecom when he came to the conclusion that he must be doing something very wrong. He'd made himself available for overtime and out-of-town shifts, completed his projects on time and on budget, spent spare evenings studying for exams and assessments, and was always respectful to his bosses. Despite this, Nicholls had been repeatedly passed over for promotion, and his meagre salary had only barely risen. That was bad enough, but what really got to him was some of the people he had grown to know across his home county of Essex, people who never really seemed to do very much, but always had a hell of a lot to show for it. Some would claim to be builders, but as far as anyone could remember, had never actually built anything. In fact, if they tried to do so much as dig a hole in their back garden, they'd make such a mess that they'd have to get someone round to sort it out. Others said they earned their living as market traders, but they'd never leave their houses before noon and then only head straight for the betting shop or the pub. They would always get the best tables at the local restaurants, never had to queue to enter the most fashionable clubs, and were always weighed down with grotesque gold jewellery, inch-thick bracelets dangling from their wrists, and chains that hung around their necks like glittery nooses. In winter, they'd jet off to the Canary Islands or the Caribbean for weeks at a time. In summer, they'd spend their afternoons cruising around the grounds of their palatial homes on a £10,000 sit-down lawnmower, or they'd hook up their jet skis to their BMW or Merc for a run down to the beach. And as Nicholls watched them, worked for them, and occasionally drank with them, so he became increasingly dissatisfied with his own life, and dreamt of the day when he might too have money to waste. In a bid to improve his lot, Nicholls quit his job and set up in business for himself. At first, he prospered and was making more money and working fewer hours than ever before, thanks to a contract with a major property firm that would build an estate full of houses and then hire Nicholls to do all the wiring. But then as the 80s drew to a close, the property market started to slow down and the firm decided to bring Nicholls in only once a home had actually been sold. As sales started to dry up, so did his income. Darren Nicholls states, I remember New Year's Eve 1989. Me, my wife Sandra and my mate Ron and his wife all went out to try and celebrate. We had £7 between us. We'd spent it all by 8 p.m. and spent the rest of the evening just feeling miserable. Everyone else was living it up, and I felt like we were just barely living. That was the night I said to myself, sod it, I just can't handle this anymore. I've got to do something. I've got to do anything. Nicholls started off small, breaking into telephone boxes. Sweet revenge against his former employers. Darren Nicholls states, in the old-style payphones, the cash box was held on with a couple of high-tensile steel bolts. Now these bolts, they're really strong in certain directions. You can't cut through them at all. If you tried to lever the box off, you'd be there till the cows come home, and all you'd end up with would be a house for the cows. But the bolts can't take being stretched. So I worked out that if you put a hydraulic car jack underneath the box and pumped it a few times, the bolts would just snap, and the cash would be yours in less than 30 seconds. Now the first time I did it, well, I was well nervous. Me and my mate Ron driven out to this phone box in the middle of nowhere to put my theory to the test. I wasn't sure if it was going to work, so I got down on the floor for a better view of what was happening. We jacked, higher and higher, and suddenly there was this fucking enormous crack as the bolt snapped and the box fell off the wall right on my head, knocked me out cold. Ron just cracked up, pissed himself laughing. When I came around a minute later, he was still at it, rolling around on the floor, giggling his head off. Now this box was seriously heavy, weighed an absolute ton. We really thought we'd struck gold. We could hear all these coins moving about. The weight of it was just unbelievable. We thought we had mother loads. When we finally got home, we got the thing open. It was a bit of a shock. There was actually £3.30 inside. But once we realised how easy it was, we went round and within a week we did every remote telephone box we could find across the whole area. It wasn't big money. I think the most we got out of one box was about £100. But I was so desperate that anything was better than nothing. After that, it became a bit of a craze. A couple of our mates joined in, so we wouldn't always use the same vehicle, and once we'd got all the remote phone boxes done, it became a bit of a game to see who had the most front. We'd end up going into the town centre in the middle of the day, pulling up in the van, running into a payphone, pumping the jack, grabbing the cash box and driving off. A couple of us nearly got caught. BT started putting these little micro switches into the money box, so when they fell off, the phone would send a signal back to base saying it was out of order. And whenever they got that signal, they'd send a police car out, because they knew there was a good chance that someone was trying to jack the cash box off. More than once I was in the van with a cash box in the back on my way home and I'd pass a police car, all lights and sirens on its way to where I'd just been. It started to get a bit boring, but whenever that happened I always got a real buzz. I considered breaking the law loads of times before, but I was always too scared to actually go through with it. Once I started doing it and I realised I wasn't nervous at all, I just got carried away. I was spending virtually all my time just looking for things to nick. Me and my little firm were on a roll. We started taking lead off of roofs of buildings, breaking into factories and stealing their generators, anything for a bit of extra cash. And because I ain't been caught, I just started escalating into bigger and bigger things. One of the guys I met through doing the phone boxes had a mate who managed a large department store in London. He tipped us off when they had a good load in the safe and gave us a map of the alarm system and the keys to the front door. The place had this special alarm system which would only let one person in the store at a time, and then only if they walked a certain route. So once we got through the shutters and the front door, the three of us had to stand really close together and walk in time, like our feet were tied together. We got about halfway through when we heard this sound from the front. It turned out a bunch of girls out on the piss could see us through the window. They thought it was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. But we had to keep going to fool the alarm system. I don't know what they thought we were up to, but they didn't bother to call the police. When we finally got to the safe, there was £10,000 in it, so that was a real result. I was trying to keep Sandra out of it, but once I started making proper money rather than just a bit of extra change, she demanded to know exactly what was going on. She was horrified at first, but then when I started spending some of the money I'd made on her and the kids, she had calmed down for a little while, and then got all panicky again. She was always saying to me, "You're going to go away, you're going to go away." But it got to a stage when I just couldn't do without it. Once you find out just how easy it can be, it becomes impossible to walk away from. Pretty soon I was doing something every week. Money-wise, things were a lot better than they were, but greed soon starts to take over. The problem with the petty stuff is that it doesn't pay very well, especially when you're sharing it with 2 or 3 other people. It's like the people who earn 15 grand a year, but are always broke and reckon if they only earned 18 grand that they'd have so much more cash to spare. But as soon as they get to 18 grand, they start moaning about how they need a few more grand. Crime's just the same. You do one robbery, make a little bit, then do a slightly bigger one, and the whole time you try and convince yourself that if you could just walk away with 25 grand, you wouldn't need to do it anymore. It was around this time that I got some part-time cash work on this farm in Braxted, repairing bits of machinery and keeping the generator running. As well as doing general farming, the guy had a few old barns on his land, which he rented out as cut-price business units. I got quite friendly with one of the guys who rented one, Mickey Donnelly, who along with his brother John had a reputation for being a bit of a hard case. There were all sorts of stories floating around about his exploits, and I'd heard that a couple of years earlier Mickey had been working this scam, which involved gold plating old pennies to make them look like sovereigns and then using them to rip off the jewellers. You've been listening to Blogs 19, written by Tony Thompson. This book is available to purchase online at Amazon and other online book retailers. Many thanks for joining me for this video. Very shortly you'll be able to see some other videos from the channel, including the Essex Boys playlist, which has all of the videos concerning this case in one convenient folder. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. I look forward to seeing you all again in the next video. Take care. Cheers.